Welcome to the Ranchonomics podcast, where we empower you to build a better ranch and transform your operations into a thriving business. I'm your host, John Haskell. Let's get started. Eric Moes, welcome back to the Ranchonomics podcast. Great to have you. How are you?
Good, John. Glad to be here.
Great. Well, you have introduced yourself before on this podcast. I'll ask you to just give a brief introduction again. Today, we are going to talk about strategy. And strategy, I think we both agree, is a vastly misunderstood concept in the world of business and in ranching. And I'd like to get that in depth, but let's jump in with just give us a quick background and then we'll get started.
Sure. Yeah. So as I mentioned, perhaps in previous podcasts, I was in the military for 12 years as an infantry officer. About a third of that time was spent commanding soldiers on the ground at the platoon and company level. But the vast chunk of your career, even if I stretched it out for a full 30-year career, is spent as a staff officer, which is really general training camp or commander training camp. I mean, that's how commanders learn to be commanders at higher levels, to be a staff officer. And staff work is a soul-sucking endeavor. There's only so many PowerPoints a human being can produce in a 24-hour period. But I proudly earned my PowerPoint Ranger tab.
Most people that are not in the military do not understand how much PowerPoint is used in the military, even in the field of battle, right?
That's right. But what I got out of that, I didn't really appreciate it at the time, was I was learning about strategy by planning, right? So there is a link between strategy and planning, but as well, I'm sure we'll talk about, there's no such thing as strategic planning. You can plan strategically, but a strategic plan as a noun, as a thing, is a bit of an oxymoron. Anyway, so I experienced that as a staff officer. But even then, coming out of the military, I didn't really know how to translate that into civilian language. And then when I started learning about business, it's like we just use the word strategy in front of other words to kind of sound important, right? We don't plan, we strategically plan. Right? Or we don't do marketing, we do strategic marketing. And the other component to that misconception is that strategy is big and important and tactics are small and unimportant. And that's not true. And so I've kind of been on a bit of a mission to figure out what strategy is.
Awesome. So what have you found?
Well, the good news is you really just have to read a book. It's called Playing to Win, which is co-authored by a great strategic thinker that comes out of the academic world, but he's done some real world consulting. His name is Roger Martin, and he has come up with a very, very simple way of understanding strategy. And when I read the book, I'm like, this is what I've been searching for. This explains the overly complicated nature of strategy that the military does. And it also adds to the oversimplification of what strategy is in the civilian world.
So let's talk about strategy. So again, give us kind of a definition or tell us what it is and what it isn't.
So the definition of strategy is a little underwhelming. It's kind of boring, but Roger Martin defines strategy as simply being a set of interrelated and powerful choices that positions the organization to win. And a lot of people might be like, well, duh, but that's what it is. And then he fleshes it out in this thing called a strategic cascade. And it's a series of 5 iterative questions. Iterative meaning that you only have to get the answer to question 1 good enough to proceed to question 2. Same with question 3, 4, 5, because in the development of questions 2, 3, 4, that actually makes the previous question more clear. And that's what I love about it, is you don't have to get these questions perfect. You just have to run through them several cycles. So if I can, I'll briefly explain those 5 steps.
You bet.
So the first is asking yourself, what is your winning aspiration? And that can be viewed as a mini vision statement. So if your vision statement is for the entire business as a whole, looking at a 5-year horizon, the winning aspiration is a description of the end state or the outcome you want on completion of the strategy. The key here is that you do not want to describe a plain to play status quo winning aspiration. you want to make a distinction between playing to play and playing to win. And so there's some guiding questions on how to do that. But once you have a good enough idea of what the finish line looks like and how it really will win, then you proceed to question 2. And this cascade is really a glorified sports analogy. So if you don't play sports, you're just going to have to make the leap into a different thing that you're familiar with. But the second question is, where will we play? Right? On what sport field? Or what sport are we playing? Are we playing lacrosse or are we playing football? So when we're looking at marketing, let's say for an international corporation, your where to play choice is probably a region or a key demographic. We can rancherize that a little bit. These could be your enterprises, potentially. Are you going to win on the field of short-term cash generation, okay, which lends itself to custom grazing? Or are you going to win on the field of a long-term capital gains type strategy, developing Nevada's best bull? Okay, well, then that would be more seed stock, okay? So short-term, long-term, different enterprises. Are you going to win on the field of relationships or are you going to win on the field of litigation? Those are very obvious strategic choices. And so that is the first half of the heart of strategy. The second half of the heart of strategy is the third question, which is how will we win? Which obviously has to come out of your where to play choice. If you choose to play badminton, your how to win choice is not going to be tackling the opponent. And then once we have that figured out, then and only then do we look at our capabilities. So up to this point in time, using the 6 thinking hats, we have been red and green with a little bit of white. Okay, but now we actually have to do a gut check and we ask ourselves probably the most important question in strategy, not what is true, but what would have to be true, right? Because that really unlocks the imagination. What would have to be true for the first 3 choices to play out and for you ultimately to reach the finish line? Once you come up with your list of capabilities, you basically triage them, audit them. We have this, we don't have that, but we're not willing to invest in that. And that's really where the rubber hits the road and you're like, we actually have to change our previous choices. And so then you go back to steps 1, 2, and 3 and fine tune them a little bit. Then, and only then, do you consider the last, which is what management systems are required. So think in terms of military style command, control, and communications. Do your SOPs have to change in order for this to work? Does your policy have to change in order for this to work? Do you have to move more from a decentralized to centralized management system or vice versa? And when you package all that up, what you end up getting is a theory. And Roger Martin is very strict about this, and I love it. Strategy is a theory. You have no idea if it's going to pan out or not, but you've taken some reasonable assumptions, and now you have to test the theory. And that is the reason why a strategy is not a plan. Strategy is the theory. The plan is the experiment design. This is how we're going to test this theory. And then the actual execution, that is doing the experiment itself. And then, because we're all good scientists, at the end of our execution science experiment, we make a conclusion. The strategic hypothesis was correct, in which case, how can we improve it? Or, wow, we got that one wrong. And then you go back to strategy.
Yep. So to highlight that point, strategy is a series of choices. Are we going to raise llamas? Are we going to raise emus? Are we going to raise cows? That is a choice, right? And we are trying to get ourselves out of the AFAB business model, which is we will do anything for a buck, right? Which is a theory-less business where we don't make any choices. We'll just take anything that comes. And as we develop that business out of its survival stage, we are now choosing, this is the type of customer I want to serve. This is the type of product I want to sell. This is the type of market I want to be in. This is the geography that I choose to do, et cetera. Is that fair?
It is. It is. And people are probably struggling, well, what's a strategic level choice? And so then they go down the rabbit hole, what's the difference between strategy and tactics? And we can maybe talk about that a little later. But Roger Martin has this awesome litmus test to help you decide whether or not your decision itself is truly strategic. And it goes something like this. If the opposite of your strategic choice, if it's completely stupid, then it's not a strategic choice. So for example, if you wake up one morning and say, wow, I want to win this year. I'm going to start feeding my cows. That's not strategic because the opposite, not feeding your cows, is pretty dumb. In other words, everyone else is already doing that.
Yeah.
It's an important decision. Yes, you got to feed your cows, but it's not strategic in nature because it's kind of like the cost of admission to play.
Yeah.
Now, if you wake up and say, you know what, we're going to move from feeding in rings or bunks or what have you. So my where to play choice is how I'm going to feed. And my how to win choice is I'm going to use bale grazing. That is strategic because the opposite of bale grazing is using feeders, and using feeders isn't universally stupid.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And the flip, some people are going to choose to feed with feeders and some people are going to bale graze. Both are credible options strategically. And so that's the litmus test of determining that your decisions are truly strategic.
Good. And for our listeners that don't know, I do want to clarify that Eric lives in British Columbia, where winter is long and dark and very snowy. So those of you in South Texas that are thinking, what do you mean everybody's feeding? We don't have to feed. Like, yeah, that's correct. So context matters here.
So true.
That's a really good point.
Running a ranch is more than just hard work. It's about vision, strategy, and execution. That's why ranching.fyi exists, to help ranchers make smarter decisions every day. With access to cutting-edge resources, online forums, and events tailored to the challenges ranchers face, ranching.fyi helps you stay ahead of the game. If you're ready to grow your operation and connect with other ranchers, head over to ranching.fyi today and see how this platform can transform your business.
So again, these choices that we make, one thing I find often is that people that have operated in the AFAB or the anything for a buck type business mentality really struggle to start to say no to things. And in my mind, one of the things that strategy does, and using Roger Martin's template does, is really forces you to say no to things. Do you want to touch on that just a little bit?
Absolutely. So making a decision of what you're not going to do is just as important as the decision of what you are going to do. But touching on the AFAB thing, you can still be extremely successful and strategic applying the AFAB. You just can't apply the AFAB to everyone at the same time at the same place. So running through the strategic cascade, I've got this winning aspiration. I want to win, blah, 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 blah. Okay, well, where will you play? I am going to play in the AFAB business. Okay, we are going to do anything, but only within 100 miles from my house, or only for the demographic of 35 to 40-year-olds. Okay, you have to limit it somehow.
So an oil field hotshot company would be an example of that type of AFAB choice, right? Where you have a certain geographic region that you serve. You might do about anything to help your customers, but here are your capabilities. Here's what you can do. Here's the limit of your reach. Is that fair?
That's right. At the end of your strategic cascade, you really do have to be a little nervous and be like, oh man.
There you go. Yep.
If you're feeling safe, then you didn't push hard enough. And most people feel nervous when they become precise because either you hit it or you missed it. Like there's no in between. I guess, using a shooting illustration, it's the difference between a shotgun blast and a long range sniper shot. We're aiming for the latter. We're aiming for that degree of precision. And it takes a lot of intellectual work to get to that point.
Okay, now the opposite of going through these strategic choices is not doing that. What does that often cause or lead to?
Well, it often leads to doing stuff that we truly don't want to do. Okay. And so even if we have a vision statement, there is still a massive gap between vision and execution. So I've mentioned a few times already, I think, the VPSP model, which other people have done different ways. That's just the vocabulary I choose. vision, purpose, strategy, plan, a lot of people go from, well, let's just face it, a lot of our neighbors are just executing. And then recent RFP graduates are like, oh, okay, I need a vision and a mission, or what I call purpose. And I'm not splitting hairs there. There's a reason for making that distinctive. So now we've got vision, purpose, and we've got execution, but we still need something that bridges that gap. How do we translate our vision into action? And that's where strategy and planning come in.
Love it. All right. So again, if strategy is a theory and the plan is how you're going to execute based on that theory, that's the test or the experimental design. What happens if we've missed the mark? What if we come back and say this doesn't work?
So your plan itself, your experiment design should have built-in feedback loops. So your plan should be phased, or it should be cascading, meaning you got to carve up that domain of time into chunks, right? Phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. At the end of every phase, there's an opportunity to adjust, to posture yourselves and your people and your resources to better execute the subsequent phase. But at the end of the operation, at the end of the activity, large or small, now you have a conclusion. Did this work or not? Was my strategic theory proven correct? And if so, what made it correct? What did we really get right? And what did we kind of not get right? And was it luck, or was it due to the strategic decisions we made? And then that feeds back into your next iteration. So maybe bail breaking doesn't work. Okay, great. What are we going to do about it? One, we're going to go back to our vision. Yeah, that still checks out. Then we're going to go to our purpose, still checks out. And then we're going to go to our strategy. And maybe we have to change our how to win choices, our where to play choices. And maybe we have to change our winning aspiration.
Love it. And so one of the things that's fun about that strategy is that it may scare you, but it is not set in stone, right? So hopefully it scares you to execute well. And yet, if things aren't working, we revisit this and we might adjust. We don't necessarily want to adjust our mission, right? We have the same purpose, but we might adjust how we actually get to that vision. Is that fair?
Absolutely. Yep, you got it.
Very good. Last thing I want to touch on, because it comes up occasionally, is when we talk about a winning aspiration and when Roger Martin and people like that talk about playing to win, we both acknowledge that it is kind of difficult to win at business, quote unquote, right? It's not like the Super Bowl where there's a clear winner and a clear loser. Would you like to just touch on that for a moment? Because I think this is something that can help clarify this in people's mind.
So my first thought on that, almost 99% of the material in the larger business world that talks about strategy is linked to marketing. Because marketing is your battlefield. You actually do have competitors competing for consumers' dollars and market share. So in that kind of business environment or context, it's still ambiguous. It's still not as clear as the Super Bowl, but there is a clear battlefield, the market, and there are clear competitors. In the ranching world, it's even more fuzzy. But we are still competing against, maybe not other people directly, but we're competing against weather. We're competing against rising costs. We're competing with ourselves, really. So a status quo winning aspiration, which wouldn't be a winning aspiration, is something like, I don't need to go back to school. I've got my 4-year egg degree. I'm good to go. That's plain to play. But a winning aspiration is, no, that information is going to get stale, assuming it was good to go to begin with. I am going to deliberately improve myself. I'm going to compete against myself and improve myself. But every year I'm going to be doing a definable professional development type deal. The where to play choice is on education. How will we win? We're going to do it every single year.
So winning in this context is very much context dependent, which is saying the same thing twice, but each of us can have a different winning aspiration for our business, right? This is kind of like a definition of done. This is what goal are we trying to hit? And your goal might be, 270 yards that way, and my goal might be 180 yards that way. But we each have that. And if we think about that as how to achieve our vision, when we achieve our vision, that is our definition of winning. Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay. And often case, not even necessarily achieving it, but moving towards it, right? That is the progress we're looking at. So I don't want people to get too binary about this and think of this in a Super Bowl-like context. I want us to think about this as, what do we really want to achieve in our business? That is incredibly individual, but what we definitely don't want to be doing is have a winning aspiration and not be moving towards it, right? If we have a place we're trying to go to, let's make sure that we are using that iterative process to make sure that we are on track towards going that direction. Is that fair?
It is. And maybe to help, one last kind of illustration, we all have those neighbors, those friends and family that do the same thing every single year. That's a playing to play strategy, which is an oxymoron. It's not really a strategy. They're not so much competing against somebody, but they're not seizing an opportunity. And that's what a good winning aspiration does, is it looks at what your neighbor is doing. What is the status quo play to play winning aspiration? Then do the exact opposite as a starting place. So a good example of this would be succession, right? The status quo way of succeeding a ranch from one generation to the other is just let time do all the work. At the very end, we do some last minute legal stuff and accounting stuff, and surprise, daughter number 2 gets the ranch. We know some people that are doing something completely different to that, and they are playing to win on the succession field. Now, their competitor isn't a real life person. Their competitor is that force that is trying to rob them from this opportunity. And they're like, no. We're going to reject passivity and we're going to fix this.
Yeah. And I think, like we talk about in marketing, where choosing not to make a decision is a decision, right? If I choose to keep my animals, it is the same as buying them. We see these cases over and over again where choosing to do the same thing over and over again, not making a choice is in fact a choice. And I think the other principle that we can pretty well hang our hat on is that the world requires growth. If we're doing the same practices our grandparents were doing in the 19th century, for example, we are not going to be competitive in the modern world. The world is advancing, and we have to continue advancing at some level just to keep up, let alone to get ahead. Right. And so there's this idea that if growth stops, if winning aspirations stop, then people die, businesses die, etc. Like those things soon just don't continue to exist.
Yes, that's a very good understanding of it.
Okay, cool. Eric, thank you very much for joining me today. When this episode comes out, you will have spoken at our annual retreat down in Orange Beach. You've got a couple of things out there. You do consulting with us and our clients, which is wonderful. You are going to be speaking in Orange Beach. Oh, and Meet Right. You have a course on ranching.fyi called Meet Right, which sort of helps people get a good framework going to get their WITBE and their WhatBe meetings in order so that they actually happen. So appreciate you joining us. Very glad you're a part of our team and look forward to visiting with you more. Thanks, Eric.
Thanks a lot, John.
Thank you for tuning into the Ranchonomics podcast. We hope this episode helped you win today. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share it with a friend.